I was on my way over and someone said, "What's your talk about?" And I said, "Well, it's about listening." And I said, "It's a little late in the day. The group's been listening for a lot of hours already today." So I'm mindful that we've all been doing a lot of listening in the audience. But I passionately believe that listening and active listening can be a way to transform your life at home, at work, and collectively, maybe a way to transform the world. I'd like to share with you a little bit about my journey of learning the impact that listening can have. For me, it sort of all started actually in high school, not too far down the road. I had this dream of living and working outside the US. I loved everything. I had so many classmates that were from outside of the US, and I said, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to go through the same journey they did of going to a new place and of learning new things. I always had this deep desire to be an explorer in some way, but I think even deeper, I just wanted to understand things, and I wanted to understand different people and cultures and ways of doing business. So for me, in 2009, I found myself in Paris, and I'd been living there for a few years, living and working, and it was an incredible experience, everything I might have dreamed of. And I worked really hard during the week, but on the weekends, culturally, people relax. It was very unusual. Even then, in 2009, if you took out your mobile phone and put it on the cafe table, people would give you strange looks, like, what are you doing? Right? Or let alone if you took out a computer and started doing email or do some kind of work. I loved it there, and I loved that work-life balance. But you can imagine, it was all the more awkward when on a Saturday afternoon, suddenly my phone rang, and it was a work phone number. I said, who would possibly call me in Paris on a Saturday? No one calls from work. We don't work on the weekends. But it was someone calling from Brazil. And they had this crazy idea for me, an opportunity for me to move to Brazil and to move with my company to begin doing things in our operations in Brazil. Now, to put it in perspective, I had never been to Brazil. I didn't know anyone from Brazil except for this gentleman who called me. I didn't speak Portuguese, and I knew that most of the people in our office didn't speak Portuguese, let alone outside the office. So I was a little bit hesitant. But sure enough, I took the challenge, and I hopped on a plane and moved to Sao Paulo. Now, Sao Paulo was just before the Olympics were announced. This bridge had actually just been built. Our office faced it, and it was an incredibly exciting time. But have you ever had that feeling when you go somewhere new and you sort of feel like people are looking at you, maybe you feel like you don't fit in, or they're listening to the words that you're saying and they're kind of judgmental or hesitant to get close with you? Well, my very first meeting, I remember the first day, it was an all-day review of our business practice in Brazil. Now, this had always been done in Portuguese, but I was a new manager there and people were really excited, and so they were trying so hard to speak English. And it was a long all-day meeting. By the middle of the day or so, I finally said, you know what, I'm going to try and sneak out to the restroom. And I got up and I started walking towards the door, and quickly the speaker immediately switched back to Portuguese, and everyone in the room just looked at me like, oh, if Aaron's leaving, then we can go back to Portuguese. I quietly went back to my seat, and I realized that my time in Brazil was going to be really challenging, partly because I didn't speak the language, and it was such a different culture, and it was such a new experience for me in so many ways. But I knew things were tough inside the office, but even more so outside the office. I was incredibly hesitant to go out and meet customers and partners and people in the market because I was afraid that without my language skills, I'd have a really hard time being successful. And then I couldn't avoid it. Suddenly, a CEO of a large retail chain in a really rural part of Brazil called and left a message and said that he heard I moved to Brazil, and he was so excited to meet me because he thought maybe I could share some new perspectives that the people in the team in Brazil hadn't thought of before. I couldn't say no, right? It was a big honor. It was a big invitation. So I went with another colleague of mine. At first, I asked around. I said, do you think this gentleman's going to speak English? And everyone sort of laughed at me in the good humor Brazilian way, like, no, there's no way this guy's going to speak English. But we went. I took a colleague, and she had promised to translate. And so we went off to this rural center in Brazil. Now, it was a really big retail store on this busy street in otherwise a small town. But it was incredibly hot. It was the middle of the summer, and I was in a full suit and tie, and it was so hot. We went to the back of the store in this little conference room where it was even a higher temperature, I think, than it was outside. And there was this plate of Brazilian foods on the table, and I sat down, and I was waiting for the gentleman to come in. And suddenly the door swung open, and this large gentleman with a big gray beard with a huge smile and his arms outstretched came in, and he was wearing a short sleeve shirt and just gave me this big hug, and he was clearly very excited to see me. So we sat down and we kind of tried to start the meeting. And he was speaking in Portuguese. And I sort of turned to my colleague who had promised me again that she would do her best to translate. She sort of said, he's speaking too fast. I can't keep up. I can't do the translation. I said, all right, I'm just going to do my best to sit here and really try and listen. And what I did is I actively listened. I looked deeply in his eyes, and I really tried to watch his facial expressions. Brazilians are very expressive, so that helped. I tried to watch his body movements and his eyes, and I was trying to get a sense of how he was feeling. And really, the only thing I could understand was that he was incredibly frustrated. So actually, that's the first thing I said, and my colleague translated. I said, you seem incredibly frustrated. I'm really sorry to hear that. And all of a sudden, this huge smile came on his face, and he started using some English words that he wasn't comfortable to use before. And he started talking, and got so excited. And what I later learned was that he felt like I understood him. Simply because I sat there and I wasn't talking, he said so many people come to him and they try and sell him things, or they do a lot of talking, and they don't pause to listen to what he has to say. And because we listened, he felt like we respected him, and he felt like we at least wanted to understand what he was saying. And by feeling respected, he felt that we could form trust and form a business relationship together. This was a huge insight because he gave us so much feedback about ways that we could make our business better and ways that we could make our products better. So when I reflected on my experience in Brazil and was meeting with so many other different types of customers, I started to realize this wasn't necessarily a new concept. In fact, our founder, Bill Gates, had wisely commented on this before, that sometimes your most unhappy customers can be your greatest source of feedback because they might be critical and they might have opinions that if you listen to them, you can actually learn how to make your product better and how to change things. And so listen, we did. I went back to the office and I said, let me tell you about this incredible experience I had. And we found a way to scale it. We went out and we went and visited many more customers and many more partners, and we got a lot more feedback. And it worked. We used that feedback to eventually change everything that we did, how we went to market, the type of advertising that we did, the messages that we did, the creative campaigns, the events. And we started to build a brand in Brazil that was fun. And it worked. Literally, we took Brazil from the 6th to the 3rd largest market in the world for PCs in 2 years. We had doubled the business. And I was this kind of hero, but all I really did was go in and just listen and get great advice and ideas from some of our existing customers. Now, I loved Brazil, but I was ready for a new challenge. And I moved in 2012 to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is this incredible city because it's this mix of East and West. Sometimes you have kind of a proper British setting and people speaking English and things are very clean. And the other side of the street, or sometimes the other side of the city, you see kind of fun, craziness, and people speaking Chinese and a lot of energy and people running around. I loved that mix of the two. But again, Hong Kong is a very local culture. And the people, the culture, the ways of doing business, the language was all very unique to Hong Kong. And I had to learn that, and I had to learn how to understand that. But I was there to work, and I remember my first day in Hong Kong. I received an email, and it had a whole bunch of the subject was country performance in Asia. And literally, Hong Kong was number 14 of 14. It was the worst performing business in the areas where we had business in Asia. I realized that I would have a lot of work to do. So I went on a listening tour. I probably filled my Outlook calendar with close to 100 meetings with employees. And now, I was the new manager in town, and there's a lot of chatter about what's this guy doing? Why is he having all these meetings? And I did 2 things that were really unusual. One, I set up meetings with all different employees, and I didn't really care who they reported to. Oftentimes, I was having meetings with people before I was even meeting their manager. And so I was breaking hierarchy in a culture where hierarchy was still important. The second thing I was doing is when I sat down, I wasn't just talking to them and telling them my plans for what we were going to do. I was asking them questions about them and about their careers and about ideas they had and maybe ways that we could make the business better. I learned a ton, enough to build a whole plan for what we could go do. And what I didn't realize at the time was that all that feedback, and by asking those questions, I earned the respect of my team, that we could go execute the plan together, and they trusted me that my plan was based on their ideas and their feedback. And that let us go and build a complete business together. I use this picture because at the same time while I was in Hong Kong, there were actually large protest movements by students against the government because they felt that the government wasn't listening to them. And this was a part of town where people literally covered the streets in Post-its, expressing their opinions and expressing their voice because they felt like no one was listening in any other way. Then I moved to Beijing. Now, Beijing might seem close, and it's all part of what we call Greater China. But mainland China, as we often refer to it from Hong Kong, is a very different place with a different language, in fact, many different languages across China, different culture, different people, and really different ways of doing business. I moved to Beijing, and to me, it was always the most exciting place because it was the most complicated, and in some ways, the hardest place in the world, it felt like, to learn to do business. The challenge there was great. No multinational company had ever built sort of a cloud-based business solutions business before, and I wanted to try and find a way for my company to be successful. I was empowered to start a new division. It was completely different than what we had before. Build our own kind of sales and marketing and product engineering and a whole bunch of kind of separate team, almost an incubated business, to try and find a way to be successful in the local culture. It was challenging. And again, I faced some of those same challenges about trying to understand the local culture and the ways of doing business. So I began a listening tour. I still remember, well, my second important challenge, aside from the business, was actually people. And I was the executive sponsor for our undergraduate and MBA students, which on its own was this incredibly interesting place because we had so many students that were coming in with new ideas and fresh opinions, but we had to try and find a way to help them assimilate into the business and to essentially be more inclusive as a company and how we respected their opinions and ideas. It was probably one of the most fun parts of my job. But my first day, I went to this manufacturing customer. And you can imagine in China, there are a lot of big manufacturing companies. But I sat down with the CEO of this company, and I said, tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what's bothering you. She was so excited because, kind of like Brazil, she said, oh, you're not from China. You must have some different perspectives that you can share. So I did. So I went and I really listened. I was trying to understand what her challenges were. And the biggest thing she talked about was her customers. She said, business has been great, and I have a lot of customers that have bought a lot of things over the years, but they're not coming back to me. The customers, they're not repeat customers. And so as a result, I'm not getting the feedback about how I need to change my products or how I need to stay relevant. And as a result of that, I feel like I'm losing business, and I'm worried about the future, and I'm worried about staying relevant. And what I realized was that that company needed loyalty. They needed to find a way to create customer loyalty. Now, the second major challenge the CEO shared with me was her people. She said, I have a good workforce, and I'm hiring a lot of talent, particularly early career stage talent. But she said, sometimes that talent, they don't stay very long. I train them, I invest in them, I help them get ready, and then maybe another job offer comes and they move on. And I'm not keeping the talent that I need in order to have a business that continues long into the future. Again, I reflected on this and I realized that what she needed was employee loyalty and trying to find a way to make those employees stay. It was clear that loyalty was what she needed, both for her employees and for her customers. But the question to me then was how. So I thought about all the different experiences I had had around the world, and again, my own reflection and my own experiences of the role that listening can play. This is actually a sign that we have in our campuses all around the world, not just in China, although it's a Chinese character, and it's a Chinese character for listening. And the idea is that when you deeply listen to someone, they feel respected, and ideally they feel understood. And when you have that sense of respect, you can begin to build trust. And trust is the foundation of any strong relationship. And so in order to create any sense of loyalty between customers and partners or with any relationship in your life, you really need this important sense of listening. That was sort of the how, or the insight that came to me. Now, I was able to take that insight, obviously, into our China business, and we did really great things. In our first year alone, we became the fastest growing division we had. We built this really great team of strong local Chinese talent who were doing really incredible things. Our customers were noticing. But I found so much that I started writing about it. I started writing articles about it. Eventually, I wrote a whole book about some of the insights that I was having from these different customer meetings and from these experiences. Because what I realized is that there's a strong connection between loyal customers and loyal employees. Because when there's a culture of listening in an organization, employees feel like their opinion matters. And then when they're engaging with customers, they're eagerly listening for feedback or ideas that a customer might have because they know that they can run back and share that with their management, and their management will listen. That connection where there's this culture that listening is a part of the workplace and that someone's opinion and idea matters is critical in developing a healthy business. A lot of times people ask me the difference between hearing and listening. And I often say that hearing is something that's passive, right? We listen to headphones, we hear sounds when we walk down the street. But listening is truly something that's active, and it takes focus, and it takes a strong desire to actually understand the other person. Now, all these places that I went and places that I've worked and lived, I didn't go with the answers. I went with this curiosity to understand, and listening was how I got to understand. So the next time any of you are meeting with a colleague or a classmate or a coach or a mentor or a friend or a family member, I encourage you to actively listen. Close the laptop, put your phone away, and look in the eyes of the person that you're speaking with. I truly believe that the language of listening can cross cultural barriers, and it can lead to a world of greater understanding. Even when we disagree, understanding different perspectives can lead to a better world, and it's a world that I believe we all want to live in, and I certainly hope that you agree. Thank you.